She didn't ask. She told him. Sarah Mitchell, worth $4.2 billion, feared by boardrooms across 3 continents, walked into that construction trailer, looked a man she barely knew dead in the eyes, and said 6 words that changed both their lives forever. I need you to get me pregnant. No dinner, no romance, no apology, just a contract already printed, already signed on her side, slid across a dusty table like a business acquisition. But what Sarah Mitchell didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the man sitting across from her had already buried one woman he loved, and he wasn't about to let anyone turn connection into paperwork again. The morning it started, James Walker made a choice that would cost him everything he'd worked for. Tuesday, 4:47 p.m., standing outside a contractor's trailer on the south end of the city, holding a report that represented 2 weeks of careful documentation and the end of a $200,000 contract. The Meridian Tower project stretched behind him, steel skeleton rising against a gray sky. Foundation poured 3 weeks earlier, crews already framing the first 10 floors. Somewhere in that concrete, buried under rebar and aggregate, was a mistake. Not an accident, a decision. Someone had poured footings at 36 inches instead of the specified 42, saving maybe $15,000 in materials and labor, creating a structural flaw that wouldn't show itself for a decade, but would eventually crack the building's integrity like a fault line waiting for the right pressure. James had found it during a routine inspection, measuring depths against the approved plans, double-checking load calculations because that was what he did, what he'd always done since his first day on a job site 16 years ago. Document everything, trust nothing, verify twice. The numbers hadn't matched. He'd gone back with a core sample drill, pulled concrete from 3 different points along the south foundation, sent them to an independent lab. The results confirmed what the measurements had already told him. Someone had cut corners, buried the evidence under 10,000 cubic yards of structural concrete, and moved on. He could walk away. The subcontract wasn't his responsibility beyond the scope he'd been hired for, and foundation work had been handled by a different crew, a different company, before he'd even signed on. No one would blame him for staying quiet. No one would know he'd found the problem. But in 10 years, when stress fractures started showing in the south wall, when the building developed the kind of slow, catastrophic failure that engineering investigations would trace back to this exact decision, James Walker's name would be nowhere in the record. He would be safe. 300 people working in that building every day would not. The notebook sat heavy in his jacket pocket, 47 pages of careful handwriting, dates and observations, and small details about a woman who died 3 years ago. Melissa had always said the same thing when he brought home a problem from work, when he'd sit at their kitchen table worrying over some contractor's shortcut or some project manager's pressure to sign off on work that wasn't quite right. Do what lets you sleep at night. Do what lets you look Emma in the eyes tomorrow morning. The simple math of integrity, the kind that didn't calculate cost-benefit ratios or weigh personal consequences against abstract future harm. Just the clear line between right and wrong, and the understanding that crossing it once made crossing it again a little easier each time. James pulled open the trailer door and stepped inside. 3 men looked up from a table covered in blueprints and coffee-stained paperwork. Linda Cooper, the project manager, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, the kind of competence that came from 2 decades of keeping schedules and budgets on track. Gerald Reeves, the general contractor, older, weathered, hands that had held tools before they'd held contracts. And a 3rd man James didn't recognize. Younger, expensive suit. The polished look of someone who spent more time in conference rooms than on job sites. Linda straightened. James, good. You're here. We need to go over the elevator shaft clearances before tomorrow's inspection. James set his hard hat on the table. He didn't sit down. This isn't about elevator shafts. The south foundation footings are 6 inches shallow, 36 instead of 42. I've documented it, sent core samples to an independent lab, and filed a report with the city inspector's office. The room went very still, the kind of still that comes right before everything breaks. Linda's face shifted through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: confusion, comprehension, calculation. That report was internal. It shouldn't have gone anywhere without clearance. I documented it 3 weeks ago, James said, keeping his voice level. Professional, the tone of a man presenting facts rather than accusations. Sent it up through proper channels. When it didn't reach anyone with authority to make decisions, I escalated. The foundation is compromised. It needs to be torn out and repoured to specification, or this building develops structural problems in a decade that cost 10 times what we'd spend fixing it now. Gerald stood slowly, the movement of a man whose entire budget had just caught fire. Do you have any idea what you're talking about? Do you understand the timeline implications of ripping out 3,000 square feet of cured foundation concrete? I understand the liability implications of building on top of inadequate footings, James said. In 10 years, maybe 15 if the soil conditions stay stable, this section develops stress fractures. In 20, you're looking at a lawsuit that makes the repair costs look like a rounding error. The third man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need volume. And you put this in writing? Filed it with the city? James looked at him directly. I document everything. It's the only thing that protects you when people decide the truth is inconvenient. Linda's jaw tightened. The subcontract you signed had a non-disclosure clause. This kind of unilateral action, going outside the project team, filing reports with external agencies without authorization, that's grounds for immediate termination. Then terminate me, James said, but the report stands. The foundation is compromised, the documentation is filed, and anyone who builds on top of what's there right now is making a choice to ignore a known safety issue. I'm not going to be part of that choice. He turned and walked out before anyone could respond. The late afternoon air hit cold against his face, construction noise washing over him, the sounds of a job site that would keep running without him, that had already moved on from the decision he'd just made. His truck sat in the gravel lot, dusty and practical, the kind of vehicle a working contractor drove, the kind that had Emma's car seat in the back and a toolbox that had belonged to his father before him. His phone buzzed before he reached it. A text from Linda, 2 words. You're done. Just like that. 16 weeks of work, the largest contract his firm had landed in 2 years. The security that had let him plan more than 3 months ahead for the first time since Melissa died, gone. Because he'd chosen to document a problem instead of ignoring it. Because he'd elevated a safety concern instead of trusting the system to handle something the system had already demonstrated it intended to bury. James sat in his truck for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, not starting the engine. The notebook pressed against his ribs, through his jacket. 47 pages of memories written down because Emma had been 5 when her mother died. And already she was forgetting the sound of Melissa's laugh, the way she sang off-key in the shower, the specific combination of vanilla and coffee that had always meant home. What did Mom smell like, Daddy? Emma had asked 2 nights ago, and James had gone to the notebook, found the entry from July 14th, 3 years back, the day they'd bought new laundry detergent, and Melissa had declared the old scent superior. These small details, archived against forgetting, because memory was a sieve and love leaked through if you didn't catch it in words and dates and specifics. Do what lets you look Emma in the eyes tomorrow morning. He'd done that. The cost would come later, in bills and budget recalculations, and the particular stress of a single father trying to make a small contracting firm work in a market that didn't forgive gaps in cash flow. But he'd done the right thing, and that was what he'd teach his daughter when she was old enough to understand the difference between choices that felt good and choices that were good. James started the truck and pulled out of the lot, heading east toward the aftercare center where Emma would be waiting, where she always waited with her backpack and her astronomy notebook and the patient expression of a child who'd learned early that sometimes Daddy was late, but he always came. The drive took 23 minutes, enough time for his mind to run the numbers he'd been avoiding. Savings would cover 3 months if he was careful, maybe 4 if he took every small job that came in and didn't turn down anything, no matter how far outside his specialty. The rent was fixed, the insurance non-negotiable, Emma's school and aftercare, and the standing medical appointments that had become routine after Melissa died, after he'd become the only parent, the only everything. He'd make it work. He always had. The question was never whether he could carry what needed carrying. The question was how much weight a person could hold before something essential inside them bent. The aftercare center sat in a converted elementary school, bright murals on the walls, the organized chaos of 30 children between 5 and 10, finding ways to make the hours between school dismissal and parent pickup feel less like waiting and more like living. James signed in at the front desk, passed through the security door, found Emma exactly where she always was, corner table by the window, her astronomy notebook open in front of her, a half-finished drawing of what looked like Cassiopeia spreading across 2 pages. She looked up when he came in, and her whole face changed. Not just a smile, something deeper, the visible relief of a child who'd learned too young that people could disappear and never come back, who needed the confirmation every single day that her father was solid, present, reliably there. She launched herself at him before he'd taken 3 steps, all 62 pounds of her colliding with his legs, arms wrapping around his waist. "Daddy, you're here." "I'm always here, kiddo." He caught her up, swung her once just to hear her laugh, the sound of it doing what it always did, reaching some place in his chest that had been tight since Melissa died, and loosening it just enough to breathe. "Come on, let's get you home." She grabbed her backpack with one hand, keeping the other locked around his, a connection she maintained all the way to the truck, through the car seat buckles, into the drive back toward their apartment. The afternoon light slanted gold through the windshield, and Emma chattered about her day, about the science lesson on planetary orbits, about how her friend Aisha had brought in a model of the solar system that was completely wrong about the relative distances between planets. Jupiter was way too close to Earth, Emma said, with the serious authority of an 8-year-old who'd taught herself the actual orbital mechanics. "I told Mrs. Peterson, but she said it was just a model and didn't have to be exact. But if you're teaching something, shouldn't it be right?" "Should be," James agreed. "But sometimes people care more about it looking good than being accurate." "That's dumb," Emma pronounced, and James couldn't argue. They pulled into the apartment complex parking lot, a modest 2-story building in a neighborhood that had been affordable 3 years ago and was still just barely manageable now. Home was a 2-bedroom unit on the 2nd floor, the kind of space that fit the exact needs of a widower and his daughter without room for anything extra. Melissa's paintings still hung on the living room walls, bright abstract pieces that she'd made in the year before she died when she'd taken a community art class and discovered she had a knack for color and composition. Emma had insisted they keep everything exactly where it had been, a museum of the life they'd had, and James had never found a reason to disagree. Dinner was simple, the kind of meal that happened when a working parent came home at 6 and needed to get food on the table by 6:30. Chicken, rice, steamed broccoli that Emma picked at without enthusiasm. They ate at the small kitchen table, the television off, Emma's homework spread out between their plates. Third-grade math, the kind of addition and subtraction that she handled with mechanical efficiency, her mind clearly somewhere else. "Daddy," she said, setting down her pencil, "can we do telescope time tonight?" James glanced at the window. Clear sky, temperature dropping but not unreasonable. School night, but not late if they kept it to 30 minutes. "Yeah, we can do that. After homework and before bed." She grinned, went back to her math with renewed focus, finished the worksheet in 4 minutes flat. James washed the dishes while she read ahead in her science textbook, the quiet domestic rhythm of a household that worked because both people in it understood their roles and executed them without complaint. By 7:15 they were out on the fire escape, the small balcony area that James had carefully reinforced when they'd first moved in, wide enough for a folding chair and Emma's telescope, a birthday gift from 2 years ago that had become the center of her entire world. She set up the scope with practiced ease, adjusting the angle, checking the eyepiece alignment, moving through the checklist James had taught her with the same methodical care he brought to every job site inspection. The city light pollution washed out most stars, but the moon was 3 days past full, bright and detailed, craters visible in sharp relief. Emma pressed her eye to the lens, made a small sound of satisfaction. "Daddy, come look. You can see the Mare Imbrium really clear tonight." James took his turn at the eyepiece, seeing what his daughter saw, the lunar surface in stark black and white, the familiar geography of a world that had always been exactly where it was, unchanging, reliable, in the way very little else turned out to be. "Beautiful," he said, and meant it. They stayed out there for 26 minutes, Emma calling out features as she found them, James standing behind her with his hands in his pockets, watching his daughter engage with the universe the way Melissa had engaged with painting, with that complete absorption that meant the rest of the world temporarily ceased to exist. Melissa had called it flow state, the place where time stopped meaning anything because you were so fully present in what you were doing that past and future collapsed into a single, continuous now. Emma had inherited that from her mother, the capacity to lose herself in stars, the same way Melissa had lost herself in color. When the cold finally drove them inside, Emma went through her bedtime routine with the efficiency of long practice. Teeth brushed, pajamas on, hair braided by her own hands because she'd learned to do it herself after Melissa died, and James had tried and failed to replicate the neat patterns his wife had made look effortless. She climbed into bed with the astronomy notebook, flipping back through earlier pages, and James sat on the edge of the mattress the way he had every night for 3 years. "Story?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "About Mom," Emma said, which was what she always said. James pulled the notebook from his jacket, the pages worn soft from handling, his handwriting dense and careful. He flipped to a random page, found an entry from 4 years back, when Emma had been 4 and Melissa had been alive, and the future had looked like something other than a series of problems requiring solutions. June 18th. Your mom decided to reorganize the entire kitchen at 10 o'clock at night because she couldn't find the good scissors. Took every single drawer apart, spread everything on the counter, and by midnight We had a system that lasted exactly 3 days before she couldn't remember where anything went. Emma giggled. She was bad at organizing. Worst I've ever seen, James agreed, but she was happy doing it. That was the thing about your mom. She cared more about the doing than the result. She'd start a project and get completely absorbed in it and forget to eat dinner, forget there was a world outside whatever she was focused on. You got that from her. The astronomy thing, the full absorption thing, James clarified. When you're looking at stars, you're exactly like her. Present, all in. It's a gift, kiddo. Don't lose it. Emma looked at the notebook in his hands. Do you ever forget her? The question hit like a fist, unexpected and direct. The kind of thing his daughter asked without warning, because she hadn't yet learned to soften hard questions with preamble. Every day, James said, because honesty was what he owed her, even when the truth wasn't comfortable. That's why I write things down. Memories fade faster than love does. I can love her forever, but I'll forget the small details if I don't keep them somewhere safe. What did she smell like? James didn't need the notebook for this one, like vanilla and coffee and whatever laundry detergent we were using that month. She switched brands constantly, always trying to find the perfect one, never quite satisfied. The last one she bought was lavender scented. I still use it because it reminds me of her. Emma nodded, processing this, storing it in whatever internal archive she was building of a mother she barely remembered. She closed the astronomy notebook, set it on the nightstand next to a framed photo of the three of them from 5 years ago, back when family meant 3 people instead of 2. Can I keep one of your notebook pages? Just one, so I can have her in my words too? James felt something catch in his throat. Yeah, pick whichever one you want. She reached for the notebook, flipped through carefully, stopped on a page from October 3 years back, a week after Melissa's funeral, when James had written down everything he could remember about their last day together. The ordinary details of a Tuesday morning, breakfast and coffee, and a kiss goodbye that hadn't felt significant until it became the last one. Emma traced her finger over the words, reading silently. This one. You sure? That's a hard one, kiddo. I'm sure, Emma said. I want to remember that she was real, that you loved her enough to write it down. James tore the page carefully from the notebook, handed it to his daughter, watched her fold it into precise thirds, and slip it into her own astronomy journal. She settled back into her pillows, and he pulled the blanket up to her chin, kissed her forehead the way he had every night since she'd been born. Love you, Emma Grace. Love you, Daddy. Her eyes were already closing, the exhaustion of an 8-year-old's day catching up to her. Sleep found her fast, and James stayed another minute, watching her breathe, the rise and fall of the blanket steady and certain, proof that at least one thing in his life was exactly where it needed to be. He left her door cracked open the way she liked it, light from the hallway spilling across her floor in a thin wedge, and walked back to the kitchen. The dishes were done, the apartment quiet, the particular silence of a space built for more people than currently occupied it. James made coffee, even though it was past 8, sat at the table with his laptop, opened the spreadsheet he'd been avoiding since Linda's text that afternoon. The numbers were worse when he wrote them down. 16 weeks of Meridian Tower income gone. 3 smaller contracts lined up over the next 2 months. Good work, but not enough to replace what he'd just lost. The savings account, already thin from 3 years of single-income household management, stretched to its limit. The outstanding medical bills from Emma's emergency room visit 6 weeks ago, when she'd collapsed during recess and the school had called an ambulance, when the ER doctors had found the heart murmur that her pediatrician had somehow missed in every previous exam. Mild, the cardiologist had said. Probably congenital, nothing that requires immediate intervention, but we'll want to monitor it. Follow-ups every 3 months, echocardiograms twice a year. And if it worsens, we're looking at surgical correction somewhere in the next 2 to 3 years. The kind of news that wasn't a crisis until you started calculating costs, until you realized that even good insurance had deductibles and copays and lifetime maximums, until you understood that a small structural defect in an 8-year-old's heart could accumulate expenses the same way a small structural defect in a building's foundation could accumulate stress fractures. James closed the laptop before the anxiety could spiral into something unmanageable. He'd find a way. He always had. The question was never whether he could manage. The question was what managing would require him to sacrifice, and whether he had anything left to give up that wasn't essential. His phone buzzed on the table. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Walker, this is Rebecca Harris, legal counsel for Cross Enterprises. Miss Mitchell would like to meet with you regarding your report on the Meridian Tower Foundation. Are you available tomorrow at 2 p.m.? James stared at the message. Cross Enterprises was the developer, the money behind the entire Meridian project, the entity that owned the building currently rising on compromised footings. Sarah Mitchell was the CEO, a name he'd seen on contracts and press releases, but never met, the kind of executive who existed 3 levels of abstraction above the actual work of construction. If she wanted to meet with him directly, it meant his report had reached someone with the authority to actually do something about it. Or it meant they were building a legal case to bury him for breaking his non-disclosure agreement. Either way, saying no wasn't an option. He typed back, "I'll be there." The response came instantly. "Conference room B, 43rd floor, Cross Tower, downtown. Security will have your credentials." James set the phone down, finished his coffee, sat in the quiet apartment, and tried to calculate what it meant that a billionaire CEO wanted to meet with a contractor who'd just blown up her flagship development project. Nothing good, probably, but also nothing he could avoid, and avoidance had never been his style anyway. Face problems directly, deal with consequences, honestly, document everything in case the truth later became inconvenient to people with more money and better lawyers. He went to bed at 10:30, lay awake until almost midnight, running scenarios, none of them optimistic. Sleep came eventually, thin and unsatisfying, broken by the familiar dreams that had haunted him since Melissa died. Her face in the hospital, the moment when the machines had stopped doing anything useful, the specific texture of her hand going slack in his. He woke at 6, feeling like he hadn't slept at all, went through the morning routine on autopilot. Coffee, breakfast, getting Emma ready for school, the drive to drop her off, the careful exchange of "I love you" and "see you tonight," that bookended every separation, because he'd learned the hard way that goodbyes should always be said, like they might be the last ones. By 1:45, he was standing outside Cross Tower, a 43-story glass monument to exactly the kind of success his life had never touched. The lobby was all marble and steel, the security desk staffed by professionals who'd been briefed on his arrival. "Mr. Walker," they said before he'd finished approaching, "Ms. Mitchell is expecting you. 43rd floor, elevator bank C." The ride up was smooth and silent, the kind of engineering that cost more money than most people made in a year, delivering him to a floor that looked like every corporate headquarters he'd ever seen in movies. Glass walls, expensive furniture, the sterile aesthetic of a place designed to intimidate rather than welcome. A woman in her 30s, perfectly composed, met him at the elevator. "Mr. Walker, I'm Rebecca Harris. Thank you for coming on short notice. If you'll follow me. She led him down a corridor, through a set of double doors, into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The Meridian Tower socket was visible in the distance, steel bones against gray sky, still rising despite everything. And, sitting at the head of a glass table, reading something on a tablet, was a woman who looked exactly like every photograph James had ever seen of her. Sarah Mitchell, 41, sharp-featured, the kind of beautiful that came from excellent bone structure and expensive maintenance, dressed in a gray suit that probably cost more than his truck. She looked up when he entered, didn't stand, gestured to a chair across from her. "Mr. Walker, thank you for coming. I've read your report." James sat. He didn't take off his jacket. "Ma'am." Sarah set down the tablet. 23 pages, she said. Photographs, measurements, core sample analysis, timeline documentation, correspondence records showing you filed this internally 3 weeks ago and it was never escalated. She looked at him with eyes that were very blue and very cold. "Walk me through it." So he did. Professional, precise, the same way he'd document a site inspection for any client. The initial measurements that hadn't matched specifications. The core samples that confirmed the discrepancy. The report filed through proper channels that disappeared into project management and never surfaced. The decision to escalate to the city inspector when internal mechanisms failed. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she opened a folder on the table, pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is a termination notice from Linda Cooper, citing breach of non-disclosure and unauthorized external communications." She slid it across the table. "Is this accurate?" "I reported a safety issue," James said. "The NDA doesn't override structural integrity requirements or legal obligations to report code violations." "No," Sarah agreed. "It doesn't." She pulled the paper back, set it aside. "The footings will be torn out and repoured to specification. I've already authorized the budget. Timeline impact is 6 weeks. Costs are manageable." She paused. "You were right to escalate." James felt something in his chest unwind slightly. "So I'm not being sued." "You're not being sued," Sarah confirmed. "You're being thanked for documenting a problem that my project management team failed to surface through appropriate channels." She closed the folder. "Linda Cooper has been terminated. The general contractor is under review. Your subcontract will be reinstated with a bonus for the delay and the professional integrity you demonstrated in a situation where most people would have stayed quiet." James looked at her. The whole meeting had taken maybe 4 minutes, and already it was clearly over. The business concluded. His presence no longer required. He should say, "Thank you," should stand up and leave, should take the win, and not question the motives of a woman who just handed him back the contract that Linda had taken away. Instead, he said, "Why?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Why what? Why meet with me directly? You've got lawyers, project managers, a whole staff whose job is handling this kind of situation. Why take the time to sit across a table from a contractor you've never met?" "Because I wanted to see who you were," Sarah said. "I get a lot of reports. Most of them are carefully worded to avoid blame, structured to make problems sound like someone else's responsibility. Yours was different. You didn't hedge. You didn't soften the language. You documented a problem, proposed a solution, and put your name on it, knowing it would cost you." She leaned back slightly in her chair. "I respect that." James nodded slowly. "Appreciate it, ma'am." He stood, picked up his hard hat from the table, turned toward the door. "Mr. Walker." He stopped, looked back. Sarah was still sitting, but something in her expression had shifted. Less CEO, more something he couldn't quite identify. I have a question. It's personal, not professional. You can decline to answer. Ask, James said. The report mentioned you run your own firm, Cole Structural Solutions. How long have you been independent? 7 years? Started it after I got out of the service. Built it slowly, good reputation, solid client base, nothing massive but honest work. Family? Widower, James said. 3 years, one daughter, 8 years old. It's just the two of us. Sarah's face did something complicated, a micro-expression that came and went too fast to read clearly. She nodded. Thank you for your time, Mr. Walker. Rebecca will see you out. The meeting was over. James left the conference room, followed Rebecca back to the elevators, rode down to the lobby in silence. Outside, the afternoon air felt cold and clean, the sky still gray, but breaking up toward the west. He sat in his truck for a long moment before starting the engine, trying to process what had just happened. Contract reinstated, bonus authorized, a CEO taking 4 minutes of her day to meet personally with someone so far below her organizational altitude that they'd never normally occupy the same building, much less the same room. Something about it didn't fit, but the contract was back, and that was what mattered. Everything else was speculation. He checked the time. 2:45. Emma's school got out at 3:20, aftercare pickup at 6. He had work to do, calls to make, the business of running a small firm that couldn't afford to waste the hours between 2 and 6 doing nothing productive. James pulled out of the parking structure, merged into traffic, let the rhythm of driving smooth out the jagged edges of the day. By the time he picked up Emma that evening, the whole thing had settled into memory as just another strange turn in a life that had contained enough strange turns to make one more barely register. His daughter climbed into the truck with her backpack and her astronomy notebook, chattering about a substitute teacher who'd let them watch a documentary about the International Space Station. And James listened with half his attention while the other half calculated timelines and budgets and the particular relief of having dodged a bullet he hadn't fully realized was aimed at him. That night, after dinner and homework and the 30 minutes of telescope time that had become their ritual, after Emma was asleep and the apartment was quiet, James sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and updated the spreadsheet. The Meridian contract restored. The bonus, substantial enough to cover 3 months of expenses without touching savings. The small contracts he'd lined up as backup, still available, still income. The numbers worked again. Not comfortably, not with any margin for error, but they worked. He closed the laptop, made coffee he didn't drink, sat in the kitchen, and thought about Sarah Mitchell sitting across a conference table asking personal questions that had nothing to do with construction contracts or structural engineering. Something in her face when he'd mentioned being a widower, when he'd said it was just him and Emma, recognition maybe, or something else, something he couldn't name because it had been 3 years since he'd let himself think about human connection as anything other than the bond between father and daughter, the relationship that defined his entire world because it was the only one he had left. Melissa was gone. That fact was 3 years old and still felt new every morning. The absence that never quite became absence, just a present tense missing that would last the rest of his life. He'd made peace with it the way a person makes peace with a scar, not by forgetting the wound, but by accepting that the mark would always be there, visible or hidden, shaping everything that came after. The notebook sat on the table, 46 pages now, one torn out and given to Emma. James opened it to a random page, found an entry from 18 months after Melissa died, the point when grief had finally dulled enough to let him function without feeling like he was performing the motions of a life rather than living one. She would have wanted you to be happy, he'd written. She said that, the last conscious day. Don't stop living because I did. But happiness felt like a betrayal when the person who'd taught him what it meant was gone. And living felt like moving forward when the only direction that mattered was backward, to when 3 people had occupied this apartment instead of 2. He closed the notebook, left the coffee untouched, went to bed, knowing sleep wouldn't come easy, but would come eventually, that tomorrow was Thursday, and Emma had a doctor's appointment after school, the 3-month follow-up for the heart murmur, the routine check that would probably be fine but carried enough weight to make him tense until it was over. Thursday came, and with it the appointment. Dr. Reynolds, the pediatric cardiologist, a woman in her 50s, with the calm competence of someone who'd seen enough hearts to know which irregularities mattered and which didn't. She listened to Emma's chest with a stethoscope, frowned slightly, listened again, ran an echocardiogram, the ultrasound wand pressed against Emma's ribs, while a monitor showed the chambers of her heart in grainy black and white, valves opening and closing in rhythm. When it was over, Dr. Reynolds printed images, studied them against the previous scan from 6 weeks earlier. "Mr. Walker, can I speak with you privately?" James followed her into the hallway, leaving Emma in the exam room with a nurse and a tablet playing cartoons. Dr. Reynolds closed the door, turned to face him with an expression that wasn't quite worry, but wasn't reassurance either. "The murmur's worsening," she said. "Not dramatically, but measurably. The valve isn't closing completely, and we're seeing regurgitation that wasn't present in the last scan." She showed him the images, pointing to details he didn't understand but could see were different. The flow patterns changed, the chamber dimensions slightly enlarged. "I'm recommending surgical correction within the next 3 months." James felt the floor shift under him. 3 months. "It's not an emergency," Dr. Reynolds clarified, "but we don't want to wait much longer. The procedure is routine, minimally invasive, excellent success rate. She'll be in the hospital 2 days, home recovery another week, and then back to normal activity within a month. What's the cost?" Dr. Reynolds hesitated. "With your insurance, probably $40,000 to $50,000 out of pocket. The hospital has payment plans, financial assistance programs. We can connect you with a social worker who specializes in helping families navigate the billing. $40,000 to $50,000. James heard the number, absorbed it, set it aside to deal with later, because Emma was in the exam room and he needed to walk back in there with a face that didn't show panic. "Okay, what's the next step? I'll refer you to a pediatric cardiac surgeon. Dr. Kim, excellent reputation, does about 200 of these procedures a year. She'll want to see Emma within 2 weeks, run her own assessment, schedule the surgery." Dr. Reynolds put a hand on his arm, the gesture brief but genuine. "I know this is a lot, but Emma's young, she's healthy otherwise, her heart is strong. This is fixable, Mr. Walker. We caught it early. That's what matters." James nodded, went back into the exam room, where Emma was watching a cartoon about space exploration, completely absorbed, unaware that the next 3 months of her life had just been mapped out in a conversation she hadn't been part of. He signed the discharge paperwork, made the follow-up appointment, walked with his daughter back to the truck. In the car, Emma turned to him with the directness of a child who'd learned to read adult faces better than most adults. "Is something wrong with my heart?" James kept his eyes on the road. "The valve isn't closing all the way. You're going to need a small surgery to fix it. Nothing scary, kiddo. Doctors do this all the time."
"Will it hurt?" "They'll put you to sleep. You won't feel anything. And when you wake up, your heart will work better."
Emma processed this. "Okay. When?" "Couple months. We'll know more after you meet the surgeon." She nodded, went back to looking out the window, and James wondered, not for the first time, at his daughter's capacity to accept hard news with equanimity, to take the things that terrified him and file them under things that happen, things you deal with, without the catastrophizing that came so easily to adults who'd lived long enough to know all the ways things could go wrong. That night, after Emma was asleep, James sat at the kitchen table with the laptop and ran the numbers he'd been avoiding since Dr. Reynolds had said 40 to 50,000. The savings account, already depleted, held 12,000. He could borrow 20 from the business line of credit, though that would put the firm underwater if any major expenses came up in the next year. The Meridian bonus would cover another 8, maybe 9, if he was careful. That left him 11,000 short, minimum, and that was assuming the low end of the estimate, assuming no complications, assuming insurance covered everything they said they would. He could ask family, but the list of people who had $11,000 to loan a widower contractor was exactly 0 people long. He could take out a personal loan, though the interest rates would be punishing, and the payments would eat his monthly budget down to nothing. He could liquidate the retirement account, pay the penalties, take the tax hit, and cover it that way, though that felt like robbing his future self to pay his present self and leaving Emma with nothing if something happened to him. James closed the laptop before the spiral could pull him under. He'd figure it out. There wasn't another option. Emma needed surgery. The surgery cost money, and if the money didn't exist in the places he'd already looked, then he'd find it in places he hadn't looked yet. Simple math, the kind that didn't care about stress or fear or the particular weight of being a single parent responsible for a child's life in ways that married couples got to split between 2 people. His phone buzzed on the table. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Walker, this is Sarah Mitchell. I hope this isn't intrusive. I wanted to follow up on our meeting earlier this week. Would you be available for coffee Saturday morning? 9 a.m., place on Clement Street, called Morning Grounds. My treat. Just conversation. Nothing professional." James stared at the message. Read it twice. A billionaire CEO asking a contractor to coffee. Just conversation. Nothing professional. The kind of invitation that made no sense unless it made perfect sense, unless the personal questions from the conference room meeting had been leading somewhere, unless Sarah Mitchell was a human being with human motivations beneath the corporate armor. He typed back, "I'll be there." The response came fast. "Good. See you Saturday." James set the phone down, sat in the quiet kitchen, tried to understand what was happening. A woman he'd met once, for 4 minutes, in a professional context, was asking him to coffee in a clearly non-professional context. The timing felt wrong. Emma's surgery, the money he didn't have, the particular vulnerability of being a single parent carrying weight he couldn't put down. He didn't have space in his life for complications, for the kind of human connection that required emotional bandwidth he'd dedicated entirely to his daughter, but he'd said yes. And Sarah Mitchell was the kind of woman who didn't ask questions she didn't want answers to. Friday passed in the usual rhythm: work and school pickup and dinner and telescope time. Saturday morning came clear and cold, the kind of October day that promised winter without quite delivering it. James dropped Emma at his neighbor's apartment, a retired teacher named Carol, who'd adopted them both after Melissa died and treated Emma like the grandchild she'd never had. He drove to Clement Street, found Morning Grounds tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner, the kind of neighborhood coffee shop that survived on regulars and quality rather than location. Sarah Mitchell was already there, sitting at a table near the back window, dressed in jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back, no makeup that he could see. She looked like a different person than the CEO from the conference room, younger and less armored, almost approachable. She saw him, waved. James walked over, sat down across from her, and tried to remember the last time he'd had coffee with a woman who wasn't his daughter's teacher or doctor. "You came," Sarah said. "I said I would," James replied. "People say things." She gestured to a cup already waiting on his end of the table. "Black coffee, right?" I guessed. "Good guess." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that wasn't quite awkward, but wasn't quite comfortable either. Then Sarah said simply, "I have a proposition." And James Walker, who'd spent the last 3 years learning to navigate the world as a widower and a father and a small business owner, trying to make ends meet while maintaining the dignity that defined everything he was, felt the floor shift again, the same way it had when Dr. Reynolds had said $40,000 to $50,000, the same way it always did when life decided to complicate itself just when he thought he'd found stable ground. He took a sip of coffee, waited. Sarah pulled a folder from the bag beside her chair, set it on the table between them, and said 6 words that James would spend the next 4 months understanding were both the worst and best thing anyone had ever said to him. "I need you to get me pregnant." James didn't move. The coffee cup stayed exactly where it was, halfway between the table and his mouth, his hand locked in place like someone had pressed pause on his entire nervous system. The folder sat between them, crisp and official, the kind of document that came with legal weight and careful preparation. Sarah Mitchell watched him with eyes that were calm and direct, waiting for a response to 6 words that had just rewritten every assumption he'd made about why a billionaire CEO had invited a contractor to coffee on a Saturday morning. He set the cup down, very slowly, very deliberately. "Ms. Mitchell?" Sarah, James corrected himself, his voice finding its way back to something resembling normal. "I think I misheard you." "You didn't." She opened the folder, slid it across the table so he could see the first page, dense text in legal formatting, headers and subsections, and the particular language of contracts written by people who got paid to anticipate every possible outcome. "This is a proposal, not employment, not a relationship, a medical arrangement with clear terms, defined compensation, and legal protections for both parties." James looked at the document without reading it. His mind was still catching up to the conversation, trying to reconcile the professional woman from the conference room with the person sitting across from him now, asking him to father her child like it was a business transaction requiring nothing more than his signature and cooperation. "I'm not signing anything. You haven't read it yet. I don't need to." He pushed the folder back toward her side of the table. "Whatever this is, whatever you're asking, the answer is no." Sarah closed the folder, didn't put it away, just let it sit there between them, a physical reminder of an offer that hadn't been accepted, but hadn't been withdrawn either. "Can I tell you why I'm asking?" "I don't think that'll change my answer, ma'am, but you can try." She took a breath, held it, let it out slow. "I'm 41 years old. I've had 2 miscarriages, one at 9 weeks, one at 22. I've been through 3 rounds of IVF, all unsuccessful. My doctor told me 6 months ago that I have maybe one more realistic window to try a new protocol, and even that isn't guaranteed." She folded her hands on the table, the gesture controlled, but not quite steady. "I want a child. I've wanted one for 15 years, and every clinical option I've pursued has failed." James heard the pain underneath the words, recognized it because he knew what grief sounded like when people tried to compress it into explanations that fit inside polite conversation. "I'm sorry. I am. But that doesn't change what you're asking me to do." "What I'm asking," Sarah said, her voice level but carrying weight, is for you to consider a proposal that benefits both of us. The compensation would be $500,000, paid in full upon confirmation of viable pregnancy. All medical expenses covered, legal documentation protecting your parental rights or lack thereof, depending on your preference, complete confidentiality unless you choose otherwise. James felt something cold settle in his chest. You're offering me $500,000 to get you pregnant. To participate in a medically supervised conception arrangement? Yes. With terms we'd negotiate together, protections built in, clear expectations on both sides. No. The word came out flat, final, carrying none of the deliberation that Sarah had probably expected. She blinked, the first crack in her composure. You haven't even considered— I don't need to consider it. James stood up, leaving the coffee untouched. Miss Mitchell, I lost my wife 3 years ago. Her name was Melissa. I loved her. I still love her. And if I ever let someone into my life again, into my daughter's life, it won't be because of a contract. Sarah's face did something complicated, emotions moving too fast to track individually. This isn't about love. This is about— I know what it's about. James picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. It's about you wanting something you can't have and thinking money can solve problems that aren't actually about resources. But some things can't be bought. Some things require you to be vulnerable, to let people see you, to risk getting hurt. And I'm not going to help you avoid that by turning myself into a transaction. He turned toward the door, got 3 steps before Sarah's voice stopped him. Mr. Walker. He didn't turn around, just stopped walking. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not even asking you to like me. I'm asking you to help me have something you already have. Something you understand the value of because you're living it every day. James looked back over his shoulder. You want to know what I understand. I understand that being a parent isn't about biology or legal arrangements or $500,000. It's about showing up every day when you're exhausted, when you don't have answers, when your kid asks you questions about a dead mother and you have to find words that are honest without being devastating. It's about putting another human being ahead of yourself for 18 years straight without pause or relief or backup. And you can't contract that. You can't structure it. You either want it enough to do the hard work or you don't. I want it, Sarah said. And for the first time, her voice cracked just slightly, just enough to reveal the person underneath the CEO armor. I want it more than anything I've ever built. But wanting and having aren't the same thing, and I don't have the luxury of waiting for the universe to deliver what I need wrapped in the package I'd prefer. Then wait anyway. James turned fully to face her. Because what you're asking me to do isn't help. It's enabling you to avoid the actual problem, which is that you're terrified of letting someone close enough to give you what you want without conditions attached. And I won't be part of that. He walked out before she could respond into the cold morning air, the door closing behind him with a soft chime. His truck was parked 2 blocks away, and he walked without seeing the street, without processing anything except the particular anger that came from being reduced to a solution for someone else's problem, from having his capacity for fatherhood treated like a commodity available for purchase. The drive back to his apartment took 8 minutes. He picked up Emma from Carol's place, listened to her talk about the cartoon they'd watched, about the breakfast Carol had made with too much syrup and not enough pancake. Inside their home, James sat on the couch and pulled his daughter into his lap, held her longer than usual, felt her small body, solid and real, against his chest. "Daddy, you're squishing me." "Sorry, kiddo." He loosened his grip, but didn't let go, just needed a hug. Emma twisted to look at his face with the particular scrutiny of a child who'd learned to read moods before words. "Are you sad?" "No, just thinking about your mom." She settled back against him, accepting this. Emma had learned early that grief was a permanent resident in their household, something that surfaced unpredictably, but always passed if you waited long enough. They sat together in silence, morning light slanting through the living room window, Melissa's paintings on the walls bright and abstract, and filled with the kind of joy that felt impossible now, but had been real once. James's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it. Buzzed again. Emma climbed off his lap, grabbed her astronomy notebook from the coffee table, settled onto the floor to work on a new star map. James pulled out the phone, saw 2 texts from Sarah Mitchell. The first, "I apologize. That was inappropriate and presumptuous. I shouldn't have approached you that way." The second, "If you're willing, I'd like to try again. Just coffee. Just conversation. No proposals, no folders, no business. Saturday next week. Same place, same time. You can say no." James stared at the messages. The smart move was to say no, to cut off whatever this was before it became more complicated than it already was. Sarah Mitchell was a client, technically, given the reinstated Meridian contract. She was also a billionaire with resources and influence, and the kind of power that made regular people nervous about saying things that might offend. And she just propositioned him in a way that reduced fatherhood to a transaction, that treated the most important relationship in his life like something available for rental. But underneath the anger, underneath the immediate revulsion at being offered money for something that shouldn't involve money, James recognized something else. Loneliness. The specific kind that came from wanting connection but only knowing how to structure acquisition, from building an empire and discovering too late that empires were cold places to live alone. He typed back, "Just coffee, no folders, no propositions. I'm there to drink caffeine and talk like humans, nothing else." Sarah's response came after a full minute. "Deal. Thank you." James put the phone away, looked at Emma on the floor, bent over her notebook with intense focus, drawing Andromeda with the careful precision she brought to everything that mattered to her. His daughter, who had half his DNA and half Melissa's, who existed because 2 people had loved each other enough to create life without contracts or legal protections or $500,000 incentives. That was what Sarah Mitchell didn't understand. That was what money couldn't buy. The week passed in its usual rhythm: work, school pickup, dinners and homework, and telescope time, the comfortable groove of a life that worked because both people in it understood their roles and executed without complaint. James took 3 meetings for smaller contracts, lined up enough work to keep the firm running through winter if the Meridian timeline held. Thursday brought Emma's appointment with Dr. Kim, the pediatric cardiac surgeon, a woman in her 40s with steady hands and the kind of calm authority that made parents feel like their children were safer than they probably were. Dr. Kim reviewed the echocardiogram images, listened to Emma's heart, ran her own ultrasound. The consultation took 90 minutes, and when it was over, she sat down with James in her office while Emma played in the waiting room. "We'll do a minimally invasive repair," Dr. Kim explained, pulling up images on her computer screen that showed Emma's heart in cross-section, the valve clearly visible, the regurgitation flow marked in red. Small incision between the ribs, catheter-based approach. We go in and reinforce the valve structure. She's young, her tissue will respond well. Recovery should be straightforward. "When? I'd like to schedule within 6 weeks. Sooner is better, but we have some flexibility." The surgery itself is 3 to 4 hours, 2 days in the hospital for monitoring, then home recovery for about 10 days before she can return to normal activity. James nodded, taking it in. And the cost? Dr. Kim's expression shifted slightly, the compassion of someone who'd had this conversation hundreds of times. With your insurance, you're looking at approximately $45,000 out of pocket. The hospital has payment plans, and there are charitable foundations that help families with medical expenses. We can connect you with a financial counselor. 45,000. The number had dropped by 5 from Dr. Reynolds' estimate, but it was still $45,000 he didn't have. I'll figure it out. Dr. Kim handed him a folder with scheduling information, contact numbers, pre-surgery instructions. Emma's going to be fine, Mr. Walker. I've done this procedure 200 times. The success rate is 97%, and complications are rare. Try not to worry. James took the folder, shook her hand, collected Emma from the waiting room. In the truck, driving back toward home, his daughter turned to him with questions about the surgery, about what would happen, about whether it would hurt. He answered each one honestly, using language she could understand, watching her process information with the same methodical calm she brought to astronomy. When they got home, Emma went straight to her room to update her star map. James sat at the kitchen table with the folder from Dr. Kim, the financial reality spreading out in front of him like an equation that didn't balance. Savings, $12,000. Business line of credit, $20,000 available. Meridian bonus, $9,000. Total, $41,000. Shortfall, $4,000. Best case scenario. He could make $4,000 work, borrow it from somewhere, find it in places he hadn't looked yet, stretch payments across enough months that the monthly hit was manageable. But that assumed the low end of estimates, assumed no complications, assumed insurance covered every single thing they claimed they would, and rejected none of the procedures or medications or follow-ups that Dr. Kim said Emma would need. James closed the folder, opened his laptop, searched for pediatric cardiac surgery, charitable foundations, spent an hour filling out applications that asked for tax returns and bank statements and documentation of need. The forms wanted proof he couldn't afford to save his daughter's life, wanted him to demonstrate financial insufficiency in language designed to be humiliating, wanted him to beg strangers for money because the system had decided that healthcare costs should destroy families rather than be distributed across the society that claimed to care about children. By the time he finished, it was past Emma's bedtime. He found her asleep on her bedroom floor, the astronomy notebook open beside her, a half-finished drawing of Corvus spread across 2 pages. James picked her up carefully, carried her to bed, pulled the blanket over her without waking her. She stirred slightly, made a small sound, settled back into sleep with the ease of a child who didn't yet understand that the world was full of problems money could solve and money could create in equal measure. Saturday came. James dropped Emma at Carol's again, drove to Clement Street, parked in the same spot he'd used the week before. Morning grounds looked exactly the same neighborhood coffee shop with the same early morning regulars. Sarah Mitchell was at the same table, same jeans and sweater, same pulled-back hair. But this time, when James sat down, she slid a cup of coffee toward him without preamble. Black, 2 sugars. She smiled slightly. I asked last week. You said black, but you added sugar when you thought I wasn't looking. James took the cup. Good memory. Part of the job. Sarah had her own coffee, something complicated with foam. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Then she said, I owe you an apology. Not the text message apology, a real one. You don't owe me anything. I do. Sarah set down her cup. What I asked you last week was wrong. Not wrong like a bad business decision, wrong in the way that treats a person as a means to an end. You were right to be insulted. You were right to walk out. James waited, didn't respond, let the silence sit until she filled it. I spent 20 years building a company, Sarah continued. 20 years learning how to identify problems, structure solutions, negotiate outcomes. I got very good at it. So good that I forgot there are things you can't acquire through negotiation. And when I met you, when I saw how you handled that foundation report, how you chose integrity over income, I thought, she paused, looking for words. I thought maybe you were someone who understood value beyond price. I do understand that, James said. That's why I said no. I know. Sarah picked up her cup, set it down again without drinking. Can I tell you something personal? You can say no. Go ahead. I've had 2 miscarriages. The first one happened in a hospital room while I was on a conference call closing a merger. I didn't tell anyone except my doctor. I filed the paperwork 2 days later from the same hospital bed, laptop on the rolling table, nurse asking if I had someone I could call. I said I had a conference call in 40 minutes and I'd be fine. James felt something tighten in his chest. You weren't fine. No, but I didn't have language for what I was, so I translated it into work and kept moving. Sarah's hands were wrapped around her cup now, knuckles slightly pale. The second pregnancy made it to 22 weeks, long enough to feel movement, long enough to buy one item, just one. A white blanket. I folded it in the back of a drawer and never told anyone. It's still there. The coffee shop noise continued around them, other conversations and espresso machines, and the ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning. James sat across from a woman he barely knew, listening to grief that sounded exactly like his own, shaped differently but carrying the same weight. After the second loss, Sarah said, my doctor used the word difficult 3 times in one conversation. She never said impossible, but I heard it underneath every sentence. And I've spent the last 2 years pursuing every medical option available, every specialist, every procedure. None of it worked. So when I saw you with your daughter, when I watched you pick her up from that aftercare center, saw how you held her like she was the reason everything else mattered, I felt something I haven't felt in longer than I can remember. What? Envy? Sarah looked at him directly. Pure, uncomplicated envy for someone who has exactly what I want and will never have. You don't know that. I'm 41. I have 6 months, maybe less, before the window closes completely. Time is the one resource I can't buy more of. James thought about the folder from Dr. Kim, about $45,000 and 6 weeks, and the particular terror of being a single parent responsible for a child's life in ways that involve decisions with permanent consequences. Then you need to use the time differently, not trying to structure it, not trying to make it safe, just being willing to risk getting what you want by asking for it honestly instead of trying to purchase it. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, that's what you did? After your wife died, you just let people in? No. James laughed, short and without humor. I shut it down completely for a year. Went through the motions, showed up for Emma, kept the business running, but I wasn't present. I was performing okayness. My daughter could tell. She was 5 years old, and she could tell. What changed? Emma. She climbed into my lap one night and said, Daddy, you can be sad. I'm not going to break. James felt the memory surface, sharp and clear. 8 years old, telling me it's safe to feel things. So I let myself feel them. And it turned out she was right. She didn't break. Neither did I. Sarah's eyes were bright. Not quite tears, but close. I don't know how to do that. Be vulnerable. Let people see me. I've spent my entire adult life building armor, and I'm not sure what's underneath anymore. Only one way to find out. James took a drink of his coffee. Start small. Stop trying to solve everything. Just talk to people like you're a person instead of a CEO. Is that what we're doing? Talking like people? I think so. Unless you're about to pull out another folder. Sarah smiled, real and unguarded, and James saw for the first time what she might look like if the armor came off completely. No folders, just this, just coffee and conversation with someone who doesn't want anything from me except honesty. They stayed at that table for 2 hours, not talking about contracts or construction projects or anything that lived inside a conference room. Sarah told him about her mother, who'd worked 2 jobs and still never had enough, who'd taught her daughter that success meant building a life where enough was a word that no longer applied. James told her about Melissa, about the notebook with 46 pages of memories, about how Emma asked questions that required him to consult the archive because his own recall wasn't reliable anymore. What was she like? Sarah asked. Stubborn, funny, completely disorganized. James could feel himself smiling despite the ache that came with remembering. She'd start a project at 10 p.m., take apart every drawer in the kitchen looking for scissors, create an organizational system that lasted 3 days before she forgot where anything was. But when she focused on something, when she found something that mattered, she gave it everything. No halfway, no holding back, just full absorption. That's what Emma got from her, the astronomy obsession, the capacity for flow state, for being so present in one thing that the rest of the world stops existing. James set down his empty cup. It's a gift. Most people never find it. What did you get from her? James thought about this. Permission to not be perfect. Melissa used to say the same thing when I brought home work problems, when I'd stress about doing the right thing versus the easy thing. Do what lets you sleep at night. Do what lets you look Emma in the eyes tomorrow. Simple moral clarity, no complicated calculations. And that's why you filed the foundation report, even though it cost you the contract. That's why. Sarah was quiet, processing this. Then, I don't have that, the moral clarity part. I have cost-benefit analysis. I have strategic thinking. But when it comes to knowing the difference between what's right and what's profitable, I've trained myself to see them as the same thing, and they're not. No, James agreed, they're not. The conversation wound down naturally, the way good conversations do, finding a stopping point that felt complete rather than forced. Outside, the morning had turned bright and cold, October sun cutting through scattered clouds. They walked to the parking lot together, and at Sarah's car, she turned to face him. Thank you for giving me another chance, for coming back after She didn't finish the sentence. You were in pain. James understood that much. Pain makes people do things that don't make sense later. I'd like to do this again. Next Saturday, same time if you're willing. Just coffee, no business, just coffee. Sarah opened her car door, paused. Although I should tell you, I started the medical protocol my doctor recommended, the one that requires emotional stability and support system. I told her I have that now. James felt something shift in his chest, something he couldn't quite name. Do you? I'm working on it. Sarah smiled, one coffee at a time. She drove away, and James stood in the parking lot for a moment before getting into his truck. The drive home took 15 minutes, and he spent them thinking about what it meant to build something real with another person, what it cost, and what it required, and whether he had the capacity to do it again after 3 years of being a widower whose entire emotional bandwidth was dedicated to an 8-year-old daughter. The Saturdays became routine, not a plan, because James didn't let himself plan beyond the next week, but a rhythm. Same coffee shop, same table, same order. They talked about Emma's school, about Sarah's work, about Melissa, and the ways grief shaped itself around a life without erasing the life completely. Sarah told him about board meetings and hostile takeovers and the particular loneliness of being the most powerful person in every room. James told her about construction site politics and the satisfaction of building things that would stand for decades, about the difference between competence and corner cutting. On the fourth Saturday, Sarah asked about Emma, not about parenting in abstract, but about his actual daughter, the specific child who drew star maps and asked questions about a mother she barely remembered. "She wants to meet you," James said. "Not because I told her to, because she heard me mention your name and got curious." Sarah's face did something complicated. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because I don't know how to talk to children."
I don't know what to say that isn't condescending or too adult or just wrong. You talk to them like people.
James finished his coffee. "Emma's 8, not stupid. She'll know if you're performing. But if you're genuine, if you show up as yourself, she'll work with you. And if I'm terrible at it, then you're terrible at it, and she tells me later and we laugh about it." James pulled out his phone. "Phone. She's at my apartment right now. Come over. Meet her. Worst case scenario, you confirm you don't like children, and we both have data." Sarah looked terrified. "Right now, unless you'd prefer to schedule it and stress about it for a week." She laughed, nervous but real. "Okay, right now. Lead the way." 20 minutes later, they were climbing the stairs to James's apartment, Sarah following him with the careful uncertainty of someone entering unfamiliar territory. Inside, Emma was at the kitchen table with her astronomy notebook, drawing what looked like Cygnus with careful precision. She looked up when they came in, saw Sarah, put down her pencil. "Emma, this is Sarah." "Sarah, my daughter Emma. Hi." Emma didn't stand up, didn't perform enthusiasm, just assessed Sarah with the direct scrutiny of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend interest she didn't feel. "Hi, Emma." Sarah stood in the doorway, visibly unsure whether to advance or retreat. "Your dad mentioned you like astronomy." "I do." Emma gestured to the notebook. "I'm drawing all 88 constellations. So far, I have 43 done." Sarah moved closer to the table, looked at the drawings with genuine attention. "These are really good. The proportions are accurate." Emma's expression shifted, the careful neutrality cracking slightly. "Most adults say they're pretty. You said accurate." "Because they are." Sarah pointed to the Cygnus drawing. "You have the relative magnitudes right. Deneb is brighter than the other stars, and you showed that." Emma looked at her father with something approaching significance. "She knows constellations." "Apparently so." James leaned against the counter, watching this interaction with the particular attention of a parent trying to assess whether his child was about to accept or reject a new person. "What's your favorite?" Emma asked Sarah directly. Sarah didn't hesitate. "Corvus, the crow, southern hemisphere, 4 main stars, Apollo's myth attached." Emma stared. Then she turned to James with an expression that said something important had just happened. "She knows Corvus. I heard." James kept his voice neutral, though he felt something warm spreading through his chest. Emma flipped through her notebook to a page marked October 14th, showed Sarah a drawing of 4 stars in a distinctive pattern, the label "For Mom" written in small, neat handwriting in the corner. "This is Corvus. I drew it last month. The lines aren't perfect, but I'm going to redo it." Sarah looked at the drawing for a long moment. "Don't redo it. It's right. The information is correct, and that's what matters." Emma studied Sarah with new interest. "You think the lines don't have to be perfect? Perfect is less important than accurate, Sarah said. You got the relationships right. That's what counts. James watched his daughter process this, saw her make some internal decision that registered as acceptance. Okay, you can stay if you want. Sarah smiled, the most genuine expression James had seen on her face. Thank you. I'd like that. They spent the next hour at the kitchen table, Emma showing Sarah her star maps one by one, explaining the constellations and the myths attached, and the relative positions in the sky. Sarah listened with complete attention, asking questions that demonstrated actual interest rather than polite performance, and Emma responded with the enthusiasm she reserved for people who took her seriously. When Sarah finally left, promising to come back next Saturday, Emma turned to James with careful deliberation. I like her. She's not fake. High praise from you. She knows astronomy. Emma went back to her drawing. And she didn't talk to me like I'm little. She talked to me like a person. That's because she is one. James started making dinner, listening to Emma hum while she worked, feeling something shift in his household, something small and molecular, but present nonetheless. The fifth Saturday, Sarah came to the apartment instead of the coffee shop. The sixth Saturday, she brought materials for Emma to make a proper display board for her star maps. The seventh Saturday, she stayed for dinner, simple pasta that James made while Emma set the table with the careful precision she brought to everything that mattered. They ate together, the three of them, and the conversation flowed naturally, no awkward pauses, no performance. After Emma went to bed, Sarah stayed on the couch, and James sat in the chair across from her, and they talked the way adults talk when children aren't listening, about fear and hope and the particular weight of wanting things you couldn't control. I'm scared, Sarah said at one point, the admission coming out quiet but clear. Of what? This. She gestured vaguely at the apartment, at the evening they'd just shared. Letting myself want it, letting myself believe it might work. I've spent so long protecting myself from disappointment that I've forgotten how to hope for things without hedging. You don't hedge hope. James leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You just feel it and accept that it might not work out and feel it anyway. How do you do that? After losing Melissa, how do you let yourself hope again? I look at Emma. Every morning when I wake her up for school, every night when I tuck her in, I'm reminded that hoping worked once, that loving someone worked once. And if it worked once, it can work again. Sarah's eyes were bright, not tears, but close. What if I'm terrible at this, at letting people in, at being vulnerable? Then you're terrible at it, and you practice until you're less terrible. James held her gaze. Nobody's good at vulnerability. That's why it's scary. Doesn't mean it's wrong. She left around 10, after they'd talked through 3 cups of coffee and 2 hours of the kind of honesty that only happened late at night when people were too tired to maintain their armor. At the door, she turned back. Thank you for letting me into your life, into Emma's life. You're doing the work, James said. I'm just holding the door open. Sarah smiled, tired but real, and left. The 8th Saturday, she brought bagels and cream cheese, showed up at 8 instead of 9, helped James make breakfast, while Emma set up her telescope on the fire escape despite the morning light making stars impossible to see. The 9th Saturday, they took Emma to the Natural History Museum, spent 3 hours in the planetarium, while Emma asked questions that the docent couldn't answer, but Sarah could. The 10th Saturday, Sarah told James she was 12 weeks into the medical protocol, that her doctor was cautiously optimistic, that the emotional stability she'd needed was apparently working. The 11th Saturday, Emma came down with a fever. James called Sarah to cancel, but she showed up anyway, with soup from the place on Irving and a children's book about space exploration. She sat on the edge of Emma's bed, read to her while James made tea, and when Emma fell asleep, Mid-chapter, Sarah stayed, her hand on the blanket, watching a child who wasn't hers breathe with the particular attention of someone discovering what it felt like to care about a person without conditions attached. That night, after Emma's fever broke and she was sleeping soundly, Sarah and James sat at the kitchen table. "I need to tell you something," Sarah said. James waited. "When I started the protocol, when I told my doctor I had emotional support, I thought I was managing a variable, creating the conditions for success. But somewhere in the last 11 weeks, this stopped being management. What is it now? Real." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands weren't wrapped around her mug like she needed the warmth. "You're real. Emma's real. This feeling that I drive over here every Saturday, not because I scheduled it, but because I want to, that's real." James felt his throat tighten. "I know. Do you?" Sarah looked at him directly. "Because I need to know if what I'm feeling is mutual or if I'm reading signals that aren't there." "It's mutual." The words hung in the air between them. 3 syllables that changed everything, that acknowledged what they'd both been dancing around for weeks. "James, I don't want this to be an arrangement. I don't want this to be strategy or timeline management or controlled variables. I want this to be what it feels like." "What does it feel like?" "Like I found something I didn't know I was looking for." Sarah set down her mug. "Like for the first time in 20 years, I care more about Saturday mornings than Monday meetings." James stood up, walked around the table, took her hands, and pulled her to standing. They stood face to face in his kitchen, close enough that he could feel her breathing, see the particular vulnerability in her eyes that came from admitting want without conditions. "Say it again," he said. "I care more about Saturday mornings than Monday meetings. Not that. The other thing. I want this to be real." James kissed her, slow and deliberate and meaning it. The first time he'd kissed anyone since Melissa died. The first time he'd let himself feel something for another person that wasn't about Emma or obligation or the daily maintenance of survival. Sarah kissed him back, her hands coming up to his face, holding him like she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. When they broke apart, she was crying, real tears, not the almost tears she'd had before. "I love you," she said. "I don't know when it happened or how, but I love you. I love Emma. I love this life you've built, and I want to be part of it, not as an addition or an arrangement, but as someone who belongs here. You do belong here." James wiped her tears with his thumb. "You've belonged here since the 3rd Saturday, when Emma decided you were real." They stood together in the quiet kitchen, holding each other, and James thought about the difference between what he'd had with Melissa and what he was building with Sarah. Not better or worse, not a replacement or a consolation prize, just different. A second chance at something he'd thought was finished, evidence that love could happen more than once if you were willing to risk it. His phone buzzed on the counter. He ignored it, buzzed again. Sarah pulled back slightly. "You should check that." James picked up the phone, saw 2 texts from Dr. Kim. The first, "Schedule update. We need to move Emma's surgery earlier. Valve deterioration faster than expected. Can you come in Monday to discuss?" The second, "I know this is stressful. We'll figure out timing and logistics. Emma's going to be fine." The warmth in his chest turned cold. He showed Sarah the messages. "When?" she asked. "Monday we find out." James set the phone down. "Probably within 2 weeks instead of 6. What do you need?" James looked at her, this woman who'd come into his life asking for a transaction and had stayed long enough to become something else entirely. "I need $45,000 I don't have. I need my daughter's heart to be okay. I need to not be terrified every time I think about her in surgery. The money isn't a problem." Sarah's voice was firm. "I'll cover it. All of it.
Don't argue. Don't tell me you can't accept it. Just let me do this. Sarah, I love her too. Sarah held his gaze. Not like you do, not with the history you have, but I love her. And people who love each other help each other when help is needed. That's what this is. Let me help. James felt something crack in his chest, the careful control he'd maintained for 3 years giving way under the weight of someone offering to carry what he'd been holding alone. Okay, thank you. They stood together in the kitchen until the coffee went cold, until the night outside turned to early morning, until James's phone alarm went off, reminding him that Sunday had arrived and Emma would wake up in 2 hours, expecting pancakes and telescope time and a father who wasn't falling apart. Sarah left at dawn, promised to come back that afternoon, drove away in the gray light while James stood at the window watching her go. Inside, he made coffee, sat at the table, opened the notebook to a blank page. Today, I let someone help, he wrote. Today, I admitted I can't do everything alone. Today, I loved someone who isn't Melissa, and it didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like being allowed to be human again. He closed the notebook, went to wake Emma, started another day in a life that was changing faster than he could track, building toward something he couldn't yet see clearly but could feel taking shape. Monday morning arrived with the particular weight of appointments that determined futures, rather than documented presents. James sat across from Dr. Kim in her office while Emma played in the waiting room, cartoons streaming on a tablet that the nurse had provided with practiced efficiency. The echocardiogram images filled the computer screen, valve structures marked in red, flow patterns showing regurgitation that had worsened measurably since the last scan 3 weeks earlier. We need to move faster than I anticipated. Dr. Kim pulled up comparison images, showed James the progression in language stripped of medical jargon. The valve isn't closing properly, and the heart is working harder to compensate. Not an immediate emergency, but we're looking at surgery within 10 days, not 6 weeks. 10 days. James heard the timeline compress, felt the careful planning he'd done collapse into urgency. When exactly? Friday of next week, November 8th. We'll do pre-op Wednesday, surgery Friday morning at 7, 2 days hospital monitoring, then home recovery. Dr. Kim handed him a folder thicker than the last one, filled with instructions and consent forms and the particular bureaucracy of modern medicine. I know this is faster than you prepared for, but Emma's young, her tissue responds well, and waiting increases risks we don't need to take. The cost estimate hasn't changed, still $45,000 out of pocket. Dr. Kim's expression softened with the compassion of someone who understood that medical necessity and financial reality existed in separate universes that occasionally collided with devastating results. The financial counselor can meet with you this afternoon if you're available. That won't be necessary. James took the folder, felt its weight. It's covered. He didn't elaborate, and Dr. Kim didn't ask. They went over the pre-op requirements, the dietary restrictions, the timeline for arriving at the hospital Friday morning. Emma would need to be NPO after midnight Thursday. Nothing by mouth. Her last meal, a simple dinner that wouldn't interfere with anesthesia. Recovery would be painful but manageable. Restricted activity for 2 weeks. Follow-ups at 1 week, 1 month, 3 months. By Christmas, she'd be back to normal. Valve functioning properly. Heart no longer working overtime to compensate for structural deficiency. James collected Emma from the waiting room, drove home through Monday afternoon traffic, while his daughter asked questions about the surgery with the calm curiosity of a child who trusted adults to handle scary things competently. They stopped at the grocery store, bought ingredients for Emma's favorite dinner: chicken parmesan, garlic bread, the specific brand of vanilla ice cream she preferred,
because James needed to do something normal, something that involved feeding his daughter rather than preparing her for surgery. At home, while Emma worked on homework at the kitchen table, James called Sarah. She answered on the second ring. Friday, November 8th. Pre-op Wednesday. Surgery Friday morning. 2 days in hospital. Sarah's breath caught audibly. That's 8 days, I know. What do you need? James looked at Emma, bent over her math worksheet, pencil moving with careful precision, completely absorbed in multiplication tables, while her father discussed surgery that would require opening her chest and repairing the valve that kept her alive. I need you to be there at the hospital. Not in the room, not during surgery, but there, so when she wakes up, she sees people who love her. I'll be there. No hesitation, no negotiation. What else? James felt something loosen in his chest. That's it. Just be there. They talked for another 10 minutes, Sarah asking questions about pre-op logistics, about whether Emma understood what was happening, about how James was managing the particular terror of being a single parent facing his daughter's surgery. He answered honestly, admitting the fear he couldn't quite suppress, the calculations he kept running about survival rates and complication risks, and the particular horror of imagining a future where something went wrong. She's going to be fine. Sarah's voice carried certainty James didn't feel. Dr. Kim has done this 200 times. The success rate is 97%. Emma's healthy. She's young. Her body will heal. I know the statistics. James watched Emma finish her homework, pack her backpack with the efficient movements of long practice. Statistics don't make it less terrifying. No, but love does. Love makes you show up anyway, makes you walk into that hospital Friday morning even though you're scared, makes you hold her hand and tell her it's going to be okay even when you're not sure. You're right. I'll be there Thursday night. Sarah's tone shifted, became practical. I'll bring dinner, help with whatever needs doing before Friday. You won't go through this alone. After they hung up, James made chicken parmesan while Emma set the table, the two of them moving through their evening routine with the comfort of long repetition. Dinner was quiet, Emma eating with good appetite, James forcing himself to match her enthusiasm even though his stomach had contracted into something too tight for food. They did dishes together, Emma washing while James dried, and then telescope time on the fire escape despite cloud cover that made stars impossible. Emma didn't seem to mind the obscured sky. She adjusted the telescope anyway, going through the setup routine James had taught her, the methodical checklist that made her feel competent and in control. When she finished, she turned to him with the directness that meant serious conversation. "Daddy, am I going to die?" The question landed like a fist. James crouched down to her level, took her hands in his. "No, sweetheart. You're having surgery to fix your heart valve, and then you're going to be completely fine. But people die in surgery sometimes. I saw it on TV. Sometimes they do." James wouldn't lie to her, wouldn't pretend the world was safer than it was. "But Dr. Kim is very good at her job, and your heart is strong, and we're fixing this before it becomes a big problem. You're going to wake up Friday afternoon, you're going to be sore for a few days, and then you're going to go back to being exactly who you are." Emma processed this with her characteristic seriousness. "Will it hurt?" "For a little while, but they'll give you medicine that makes the pain manageable, and I'll be there the whole time." "What about Sarah?" "She'll be there too. Not in the operating room, but at the hospital. So when you wake up, you'll see both of us." Emma nodded, satisfied with this answer. "Okay, I'm not scared anymore." James pulled her into a hug, felt her small body solid against his chest, her heartbeat steady and present and about to be stopped deliberately so surgeons could repair the valve that wasn't closing properly. He held her longer than necessary, memorizing the feel of her, the particular weight of an 8-year-old who trusted her father to keep her safe even when safety required calculated risk. The week passed in accelerated time. Tuesday brought forms to sign, insurance authorizations to review, pre-op instructions to memorize. Wednesday was the hospital visit, blood draws, and EKG and chest x-rays, Emma sitting patiently through each procedure while James filled out paperwork that asked him to acknowledge risks, including death, brain damage, stroke, infection. He signed everything with steady hands, his signature authorizing strangers to cut open his daughter's chest because the alternative was watching her heart fail slowly over years. Thursday evening, Sarah arrived at 6 with enough food to feed a family of 5. Italian from the place on mission, good bread, salad, tiramisu for dessert. She set everything on the kitchen counter, pulled James into a hug before he could speak, held him while he tried to remember how to breathe normally. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "No, but I will be." Emma emerged from her room, saw Sarah, launched herself into a hug with the enthusiasm of a child who'd claimed this woman as part of her life without needing adult permission. Sarah caught her, held her, and James watched them together, this relationship he hadn't planned or structured but had allowed to develop organically. They ate dinner at the small kitchen table, the three of them, conversation flowing naturally despite the weight of tomorrow. Emma talked about the star map she'd finished that afternoon, about how Mrs. Peterson had finally admitted that the classroom solar system model was inaccurate and needed updating. Sarah asked questions that demonstrated genuine interest, and Emma responded with the kind of detailed explanation she reserved for people who took her seriously. After dinner, after Emma was asleep, Sarah and James sat on the couch in the living room. Melissa's paintings hung on the walls around them, bright abstracts that had been created by a woman who'd died 3 years ago, whose absence had shaped this household into its current form. "I'm terrified," James said it plainly, without hedging. "I'm terrified something goes wrong tomorrow, that I make the wrong decision, that I lose her the way I lost Melissa." Sarah took his hand. "You're not going to lose her, but if you did, if something impossible happened, you'd survive it because Emma would need you to. That's what parents do. They survive the unsurvivable because their children require it." James looked at their joined hands, at the simple fact of another person choosing to sit with him in fear rather than offering empty reassurance. "When Melissa died, I shut down for a year, performed functionality while feeling nothing. It took Emma telling me I was allowed to be sad before I could actually process it." "You won't shut down this time." "How do you know?" "Because you're not alone anymore." Sarah shifted closer, her shoulder against his. "You have me. You have Carol next door. You have a whole life you've built that includes people who love you and Emma. Grief is easier to survive when you're not carrying it solo." They sat together until midnight, talking in circles around fear, finding comfort in presence rather than words. When Sarah finally left, promising to meet them at the hospital at 6:30 Friday morning, James stood at the door, watching her car disappear down the street, feeling something he hadn't felt since Melissa died, the knowledge that another person cared about his daughter almost as much as he did. Friday morning came dark and cold. James woke Emma at 5, helped her into comfortable clothes, the loose sweatpants and t-shirt the hospital had recommended for easy dressing post-surgery. She was sleepy but calm, trusting that adults had planned this competently. They drove through empty streets, the city still sleeping, arrived at the hospital at 6:15 to find Sarah already waiting in the lobby. Emma ran to her, and Sarah lifted her up, despite hospital protocols about maintaining distance, held her while James checked in at the registration desk. The surgical wing was quiet, professional. the controlled environment of a place where life or death decisions happened with routine efficiency. They were taken to a pre-op room, small and clinical, where Emma changed into a hospital gown that was too large and made her look even smaller. The anesthesiologist came first, a man in his 30s who explained the process in language Emma could understand. She'd get sleepy medicine through an IV, fall asleep counting backward from 10, wake up after surgery, feeling groggy but safe. Emma listened with serious attention, asked 2 questions about whether the medicine hurt and whether she'd dream, received answers that satisfied her. Dr. Kim arrived at 7, scrubbed and ready, her calm presence reducing the tension in the room by half. "We're going to take excellent care of you, Emma. You're going to fall asleep, I'm going to fix your heart valve, and when you wake up, your dad and Sarah will be right here. Promise?" Emma looked at James. "Promise?" James crouched beside her bed, took her hand. "I love you more than anything in this world. When you wake up, I'll be the first thing you see. Love you too, Daddy." A nurse came to wheel Emma to the operating room. James walked alongside the bed as far as the double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only," kissed his daughter's forehead, watched her disappear into a space where he couldn't follow, where his only role was to wait and trust that strangers would protect the most important person in his life. The waiting room was beige and quiet, filled with other families in various stages of surgical anxiety. Sarah sat beside James, their hands linked, neither speaking because words felt inadequate for the particular terror of having a child in surgery. Time moved strangely, minutes stretching into hours, the clock on the wall advancing with agonizing slowness. At 8:30, a nurse came out with an update. Surgery started on time, everything proceeding normally. At 9:45, another update. Valve repair going well, no complications. At 10:30, Dr. Kim herself appeared in the waiting room, still in surgical scrubs, pulling down her mask. "She's fine. The surgery went perfectly. We repaired the valve, checked all the surrounding structures. Everything looks excellent. She's in recovery now, still under anesthesia, but she'll be awake within the hour." James felt his knees go weak. Sarah's hand tightened on his, the only thing keeping him upright. "Can we see her? Once she's awake and stable. Probably another 90 minutes. Dr. Kim smiled, the genuine warmth of someone who understood what these updates meant to parents. "She did great, Mr. Walker. Young, healthy tissue. Responded exactly how we hoped. Recovery should be straightforward." After Dr. Kim left, James sat down heavily, put his face in his hands, let himself feel the relief that came from knowing his daughter had survived the thing he'd been terrified would kill her. Sarah's arm came around his shoulders, holding him while he tried to remember how to breathe without the constant low-grade panic that had been his companion for 8 days. At noon, they were allowed into the recovery room. Emma was awake but groggy, hooked to monitors and an IV, a bandage across her chest, marking where surgeons had gone in to repair the valve that hadn't been closing properly. She saw James and tried to smile, the expression loose and unfocused. "Daddy, I'm here, sweetheart." James took her hand carefully, aware of the IV line. "Surgery's over. Dr. Kim says you did perfectly. It hurts. I know. They'll give you medicine. You're going to feel better soon." Emma's eyes found Sarah standing behind James. "You came. I promised I would." Sarah moved closer to the bed, her hand on Emma's foot through the blanket. "You're very brave." Emma's eyes drifted closed, opened again with an effort. "Can I have ice cream when I go home?" "Absolutely." James brushed hair back from her forehead. "As much ice cream as you want." She fell back asleep, the exhaustion of surgery and anesthesia pulling her under, despite her efforts to stay present. James and Sarah stayed beside the bed, watching monitors that showed heart rate and oxygen saturation and blood pressure, all the mechanical confirmations that Emma was alive and stable and healing. The next 2 days passed in hospital time, measured in medication schedules and vital sign checks, and the slow improvement of a child recovering from cardiac surgery. Emma slept most of Saturday, woke Sunday with more alertness and less pain, managed to eat solid food and walk to the bathroom with assistance. Dr. Kim discharged them Monday morning with instructions for home recovery and follow-up appointments, scheduled at intervals that would track Emma's healing over the next 3 months. At home, Emma settled onto the couch with pillows supporting her chest, the television playing cartoons she was too tired to follow. James made soup, answered her questions about when she could go back to school, 2 weeks, when she could use her telescope, 1 week, carefully, when the pain would stop, gradually, over the next 10 days. Sarah came by every evening after work, bringing dinner and helping with whatever needed doing, her presence becoming so routine that Emma started asking where Sarah was if 6 o'clock passed without her arrival. Wednesday of the second recovery week, James's phone buzzed while he was making lunch. A text from Rebecca Harris, Sarah's lawyer. "Mr. Walker, I need to speak with you urgently regarding a matter that affects both you and Ms. Mitchell. Can you call me?" James dialed immediately. Rebecca answered on the first ring. "Mr. Walker, thank you for calling. I'm going to be direct because the situation requires it. Someone has obtained private medical records belonging to Sarah Mitchell and leaked them to a journalist. The story is scheduled to run Monday unless we can get an injunction." James felt cold settle in his stomach. What records? Her fertility history, 2 miscarriages, 3 rounds of IVF, all documented. The journalist also has information about a private meeting 4 months ago in which Sarah allegedly propositioned a contractor for reproductive purposes. They're framing it as a corporate governance issue, questioning her judgment and decision-making capacity. The contract she offered me, the one I never signed. Yes. Rebecca's voice was carefully neutral. I need to know, did you tell anyone about that meeting? No one. James's mind was racing. How did they get this? We're investigating, but right now I need your help. The story names you as the contractor. They'll be reaching out for comment, probably as early as tomorrow. I need to know what you plan to say. The truth. Sarah made a proposal. I declined. We moved past it. What's between us now is private. That's good. Rebecca sounded relieved. Will you put that in writing? A statement I can provide to the journalist and use in our injunction filing? Yes. Send me whatever format you need. I'll email it within the hour. Rebecca paused. Mr. Walker, I want you to know that Sarah didn't ask me to contact you. I'm doing this because it's the right legal strategy and because she's going to need support when this becomes public. She's terrified of how this will affect you and Emma. Tell her I'm not going anywhere. After they hung up, James stood in his kitchen trying to process what it meant that someone had weaponized Sarah's medical history, had taken private pain and turned it into ammunition designed to destroy her professionally. The cruelty of it settled over him like weight, the understanding that people existed who would do this, who would see vulnerability and target it deliberately. He called Sarah. She answered, and he could hear that she'd been crying. Rebecca called you. She did. James kept his voice steady. I'm giving a statement. The truth, no hedging, and I'm not going anywhere. Sarah's breath caught. James, they're going to make this ugly. They're going to say I tried to buy you, that I used my position to pressure you, that I'm unstable and desperate and unfit to run a company. Let them say it. The truth is different. The truth is you made a mistake 4 months ago. I said no. and we built something real afterward. Anyone who can't see that isn't paying attention. My board is meeting Friday. Michael Thompson, my ex-boyfriend, he's on the board. I think he's behind this." She sounded exhausted. "He's been pushing for my removal since the Meridian project went over budget. This gives him ammunition. Then you fight." James looked out the window at the November afternoon, gray and cold. "You fight with every tool you have, and you tell the truth loudly enough that the lies don't stick. I don't know if I can do this. You can, because you're not alone anymore. You have me, you have Rebecca, you have a company you built over 20 years that belongs to you more than it belongs to anyone trying to take it. Don't let them make you small." They talked for another 30 minutes, James listening while Sarah worked through fear and anger and the particular violation of having medical records stolen and publicized. When they finally hung up, he returned to the living room where Emma was dozing on the couch, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of healing. Thursday morning, the journalist called. James let it go to voicemail, listened to a woman's voice asking for comment on his relationship with Sarah Mitchell, specifically regarding a contract proposal from August. He called Rebecca, who drafted a response and sent it to the journalist within 2 hours. The statement was simple. Ms. Mitchell and I had a professional relationship that evolved into a personal one. Any characterization beyond that is speculation and invasion of privacy. Friday, Sarah's board met in emergency session. James got updates via text from Rebecca throughout the day. Michael Thompson had presented evidence of Sarah's medical records, the contract proposal, allegations of improper conduct, and compromised judgment. Sarah had responded with her own evidence, documentation that the medical records had been obtained illegally, testimony from Rebecca about the timeline of her relationship with James, financial records showing the company had performed exceptionally under her leadership despite personal challenges. The vote came at 4 p.m. 8 board members voted to retain Sarah as CEO. 3 voted for her removal. Michael Thompson abstained. The motion failed. Sarah kept her position, and Michael was censured for bringing illegally obtained evidence to a board meeting. Sarah called James at 6, her voice shaking with relief and residual adrenaline. "I won. They voted to keep me. Michael's being investigated for the leak, and Rebecca is filing criminal complaints for HIPAA violations." James felt tension he hadn't known he was carrying release from his shoulders. "Told you. Truth wins when you tell it loudly enough. There's more." Sarah's tone shifted. "The journalist is running the story anyway, Monday morning. But Rebecca got them to change the angle. Instead of questioning my competence, it's about medical privacy violations and corporate espionage. We flipped the narrative." "Good. That's the right story." "Emma's awake. I can hear her in the background." "Go take care of her. I'll come by tomorrow." Saturday, Sarah arrived with bagels and the weekend edition of 3 major newspapers, all carrying early coverage of the medical privacy scandal. The stories focused on Richard Voss, the CEO, who'd been Sarah's rival for the Meridian contract and who'd orchestrated the theft of her medical records through a communications firm that was now under federal investigation. Sarah's fertility history was mentioned, but treated as evidence of violation rather than scandal. Her miscarriages presented as the private grief that should never have become public knowledge. The coverage was fair, even sympathetic, casting Sarah as the victim of corporate espionage rather than the unstable executive Michael Thompson had tried to portray. By Sunday, 2 more outlets had picked up the story, and by Monday morning, Richard Voss had resigned from his company pending criminal investigation. Monday afternoon, Sarah got a call from her father, Robert Mitchell, who she hadn't spoken to in 8 years, who disapproved of her career choices and her decision to prioritize work over family, who'd cut contact when she'd refused to leave Cross Enterprises to join his accounting firm. James was at the apartment when Sarah took the call, watching Emma work on a new star map at the kitchen table while Sarah stepped into the bedroom for privacy. She emerged 20 minutes later, her face complicated with emotions James couldn't parse individually. My father saw the press conference, saw the coverage. He called to say he was wrong about me. Sarah sat on the couch, and James sat beside her, close enough to touch, but giving her space to process whatever had just happened. He spent 30 years thinking success meant money and traditional family structure. Saw what I built and couldn't understand why I wasn't satisfied with just getting married and having children the conventional way. She looked at her hands.
He just told me he's proud of me. Not for the company, for having the courage to want what I want and build it honestly even when it cost me. That's good. James took her hand. That's what you needed to hear. He wants to meet you and Emma. She looked up, meeting his eyes. He wants to be part of this, whatever this is. What did you tell him? That I'd ask you first, because you and Emma, you're not props in my reconciliation with my father. You're people I love, and I won't bring someone into your lives without your permission. Emma looked up from her star map. Is Sarah's dad nice? James smiled. I don't know yet, kiddo. Want to help us find out? Emma considered this seriously. Okay, but if he's mean to Sarah, I'm going to tell him about the 88 constellations until he leaves. Deal. Sarah laughed, the sound loose and genuine. Robert Mitchell came to dinner the following Saturday. He was 68, retired, carrying the particular discomfort of a man who'd spent years being wrong and was now trying to make amends without knowing quite how. Emma assessed him with her characteristic directness, decided he was acceptable when he asked intelligent questions about her astronomy notebook, warmed to him completely when he admitted he'd never heard of Corvus. Over dinner, Robert told stories about Sarah's childhood, about a daughter who'd been relentlessly competent from age 6, who'd organized her mother's kitchen and filed her father's taxes before she was old enough to drive. Sarah sat across from her father, hearing herself described by someone who'd known her longest, reconciling the child she'd been with the woman she'd become. After Emma went to bed, the three adults sat in the living room. Robert looked at James directly. My daughter tells me you're a good man, that you chose integrity over income when it mattered, that you're raising your daughter alone, that you make Sarah happy in ways I've never seen. James met his eyes. I try to be a good man. Don't always succeed, but I try. That's all any of us can do. Robert's expression softened. I came here tonight to apologize to Sarah, but I owe you an apology too. I judged this relationship before I understood it, assumed it was something other than what it is. What is it? James asked. Family. Robert looked at his daughter. Maybe not conventional, maybe not what I pictured, but family nonetheless. The weeks that followed settled into new rhythms. Emma returned to school 3 weeks post-surgery, her chest healing well, her energy returning gradually. Sarah came over most evenings, helping with dinner and homework and the domestic routines that had once belonged only to James and Emma. Robert visited every other Saturday, building a relationship with his daughter that had been absent for almost a decade, learning to know Emma as someone who mattered rather than as an abstract concept. In December, during Emma's 1-month surgical follow-up, Dr. Kim reviewed the echocardiogram with satisfaction. Valve functioning perfectly. No regurgitation, no structural concerns. Emma's heart was as healthy as any 8-year-old's, the surgery a complete success. She was cleared for normal activity, which meant telescope time without restrictions, running at recess, all the things that made childhood feel like childhood, rather than medical management. Christmas came.
and with it the question of how to celebrate. James had spent 3 Christmases as a widower, creating traditions with Emma that honored Melissa's memory while building their own version of holiday. This year felt different, expanded to include Sarah and Robert. The apartment too small for everyone, but no one willing to suggest her celebration happen anywhere else. They put up a tree in the living room, Emma insisting on decorating it with homemade ornaments and a star she'd crafted from cardboard and aluminum foil. Sarah brought food, Robert brought wine, and they ate dinner at the kitchen table with chairs borrowed from Carol next door. After dinner, Emma opened presents with the careful deliberation she brought to everything, examining each gift thoroughly before moving to the next. James gave her a new telescope, more powerful than the one on the fire escape, the kind that could resolve details she'd only imagined before. Sarah gave her a year's subscription to an astronomy magazine and a notebook for recording observations. Robert gave her a framed star map showing the sky on the night she was born, constellations marked in silver ink. Emma looked at each gift with wonder, then looked around at the adults who'd given them. This is the best Christmas ever. After she went to bed, the 3 adults stayed in the living room, coffee cups in hand, the tree lights casting soft shadows on Melissa's paintings. James found himself thinking about the difference between the life he'd had and the life he was building. Not better or worse, but different, shaped by loss and choice and the willingness to let people in, even when letting them in meant risk. Sarah, sitting beside him on the couch, took his hand. "I need to tell you something." James waited. "I'm pregnant, 6 weeks." The protocol worked. The words hung in the air. James felt them land, felt their weight and implication, and the particular joy that came mixed with fear, because pregnancy meant hope, but also meant risk, meant possibility, but also meant the chance of loss. "How do you feel?" he asked, terrified, hopeful. She looked at him. "Grateful that I'm not doing this alone." "You're not alone." James pulled her close, felt her breathe against his shoulder. "You have me. You have Emma. You have your father. You have a whole life built around you that includes people who love you." "I know. That's what makes it different this time. That's what makes me think it might actually work." They sat together while Robert dozed in the armchair, while the tree lights blinked on and off in their programmed pattern, while the apartment held them all in warmth against the December cold outside. James thought about the notebook, with 46 pages, about Melissa, who'd told him to do what let him sleep at night, about Emma, who'd said he was allowed to be sad. He thought about how grief and love existed simultaneously, how second chances didn't erase first ones, but created something new alongside them. The months that followed brought Sarah's pregnancy into visibility. She showed at 12 weeks, the small curve of her abdomen making real what had been abstract. Emma was fascinated, asking questions about how babies developed, about whether the baby could hear her voice, about whether she'd be a good big sister. Sarah answered each question with honesty, and James watched his daughter prepare for siblinghood with the same methodical seriousness she brought to star maps. In February, during Sarah's anatomy scan, they learned the baby was a girl. Sarah cried in the ultrasound room, watching the screen show chambers and valves and the specific structures that meant healthy development. The technician printed images, and Sarah gave one to Emma that evening, pointing out the profile, the tiny hands curled near the face. "What should we name her?" Emma asked, studying the ultrasound image with scientific interest. Sarah looked at James. "We talked about this, if you're okay with it." James felt his throat tighten. "You want to name her Melissa, after your wife, after Emma's mom." Sarah's eyes were bright, because she's part of this family even though she's not here, and I want our daughter to carry that forward. Emma looked up from the ultrasound. "Baby Melissa, like Mama Melissa, exactly like that." James pulled both of them close, These two people who'd somehow become his family again, who'd made space for a woman who'd died 3 years ago to remain present in the life they were building. The baby arrived in late June, 3 days before her due date. After 16 hours of labor that tested Sarah's carefully maintained control and revealed reserves of strength James hadn't known she possessed. Melissa Rose Mitchell Walker was born at 4:47 a.m., 7 pounds 3 ounces, healthy and loud, and immediately beloved by an 8-year-old sister who held her with careful reverence. In the hospital room, while Sarah slept and baby Melissa dozed in the bassinet, Emma sat in the chair beside James and looked at her new sister with wonder. "She's so small. You were this small once." James remembered Emma as a newborn, the particular fragility of new life, the weight of being responsible for a human who couldn't survive without constant attention. "Do you think Mama Melissa would like that we named the baby after her? I think she'd love it." James looked at the sleeping infant, at Sarah recovering in the bed, at Emma who'd survived heart surgery and welcomed a new sister with equal grace. "I think she'd love all of this." A year and a half later, on a Saturday morning in November, James stood in his kitchen making pancakes while Emma taught 18-month-old Melissa about constellations, using a simplified star map she'd drawn specifically for her sister. Sarah sat at the table with coffee, Robert beside her reading the newspaper, the scene so domestic and ordinary that it felt almost surreal. The doorbell rang. James answered it to find a delivery person with a large envelope requiring signature. Inside was a formal invitation to the dedication ceremony for Meridian Tower, scheduled for the following month, recognizing James Walker for his integrity in reporting structural deficiencies that had prevented catastrophic failure. Sarah looked over his shoulder at the invitation. "You going?" "We're going," James corrected. "All of us. Because this isn't just about me. It's about what we built together." December brought the dedication ceremony, held in the lobby of Meridian Tower, 43 stories of glass and steel, built on foundations that had been torn out and repoured correctly because one contractor had chosen truth over convenience. James stood at the podium with Sarah beside him, Emma and Melissa in the front row with Robert, and spoke about the difference between competence and corner cutting, about why documentation mattered, about the simple equation of doing what let you sleep at night. After the ceremony, standing in the lobby while people congratulated him, James felt Sarah take his hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For saying no when I asked the wrong question, for making me figure out the right one, for building this with me instead of for me." James looked at Emma playing with Melissa near the windows, at Robert talking with Rebecca about legal minutiae, at the building rising above them that existed because someone had chosen integrity when integrity was expensive. "You're welcome. But we built it together. That's what family does." They drove home through winter afternoon light, Emma and Melissa in the back seat, Sarah beside him in front, Robert following in his own car. At the apartment, they made dinner together, the kitchen crowded but functional, everyone contributing something. After the meal, after Melissa was asleep and Emma was working on a new star map, the adults sat in the living room with coffee. James opened the notebook, now 47 pages, and wrote, "Today we dedicated a building. Today we celebrated choosing truth. Today I looked at my family, the one I built with Melissa and the one I'm building with Sarah, and understood that love doesn't replace love. It just grows, like foundations properly poured, strong enough to hold weight, honest enough to last." He closed the notebook, looked at Sarah, at Robert, at Emma, bent over her astronomy work, at Melissa's baby monitor showing peaceful sleep. This was success. Not the empire, not the building, not the recognition. This, the ordinary evening in a crowded apartment.
The people who chose to be there, the family assembled from loss and choice, and the willingness to try again even when trying meant risk. Outside, the city moved through its evening routines. Inside, James Walker sat with his family and felt, for the first time since Melissa died, completely at peace.